It's my great pleasure to introduce Ian Bourland. Ian is a critic of global contemporary art and historian of photography, and is currently assistant professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, my alma mater, but will be joining the faculty of Georgetown University in the fall. Many congratulations, Ian. His first monograph on Afro-British photographer Rotimi Fani-Kayode will be published by Duke University Press this winter. This talk builds on research supported by a Minor White Archive grant at Princeton and is part of his next project on the critical potential of landscape photography. Please join me in welcoming Ian Bourland.
Comparison here. All right. If you can't hear me, I can adjust this a little more too. So first I want to say thank you to Julia and Charles and the team here for organizing this wonderful event and for bringing us out from the dreary East Coast to be in beautiful Portland today. And I want to take this moment too to thank Kate and everyone at the Princeton University Art Museum, not only for the aforementioned grant and for sponsoring today's events, but also for fostering this new, exciting conversation emerging around Minor's work over the last several years. So I'm very excited to see where it all goes. All right. So this image has nothing to do with Minor White, seemingly. This is where I spend a lot of my summers. This is up for a few reasons. You can see what's happening here. This is Table Mountain framed. This is where you're supposed to take the photograph. And so there are thousands of these circulating on the internet. So this is partially to just show you that my work is mostly contemporary, often centered around Africa and other sort of global sites. And so my work on Minor kind of is happening laterally. And this is also kind of a learning process for me right out of the archive. So if people want to offer corrections or to help me as I develop this paper, I'd love to have that conversation after or later in the day. Also, I want to use this image to kind of shorthand what I'm doing in today's paper, which is to locate White in a history of image making that we might call the picturesque, and it's a larger process that we might think of as the picturesque unconscious, something that we all do and will continue to do, I think, knowingly or unknowingly as we take pictures of each other and of the world. And I think this is where White enters a kind of history that also bears on the colonial history of the Western United States as well. All right. I too am going to read for precision's sake. In 1995, the photographer Fred Hill sent a letter to curator Peter Bonnell, following up on an earlier correspondence about a local camera club that had briefly sought to restage a photograph that Minor White had taken some 50 years prior from the high prospect of Mount Emily, looking out at the valleys of eastern Oregon. Hill himself had recently published an article in the journal History of Photography, recalling the 7 years when his life intertwined with White's, from the evening camera class that took him and his mother, Lynn Hill, whom White referred to lovingly as Ma, took White as part of the WPA extension program in La Grande to the summer of 1947, when Hill left the CSFA and moved to become a technical photographer in Oakland. During that time, White periodically needled Hill from the 1940 Christmas gift he sent, a copy of Morgan and Lester's Graphic Graflex Photography, simply inscribed, quote, "in hopes of improving your lousy technique," end quote, to a 1948 letter mailed from San Francisco to Lynn Hill, by then his surrogate mother, claiming he had no address for his old friend, who had simply moved across the bay. The two men proved pivotal in each other's lives, however. As the new teacher of photography at CSFA, referred by Beaumont Newhall from New York to work alongside Adams, White sent a terse telegraph informing Hill that a place had opened for him in that year's cohort, just as the semester began. Hill promptly moved his young family and their mobile home from Tacoma, Washington, parking it in front of 129 24th Avenue near the Presidio in San Francisco, Ansel Adams' own house, where White had taken up residence. Perhaps White was returning the favor to Hill, who seems to have taken him in during the years of 1940 and 1941, when visits to Portland were infrequent and White was marooned without a car. Hill did have a car, and he recalls taking drives with White to make photographs in the surrounding Blue Mountains and Willowa Range, and the low-lying farm country in between. It must have been quite a sight for the young Minnesotan, the quintessentially western high desert terrain, the alpine cirques and lakes that rose thousands of feet from the settlements below. This region marks the course of the Snake River and the path of Lewis and Clark to the terminus of the lower 48. It was a perfect place for White to test the photographic theories he had been reading about in the library back in Portland, essays by John Paul Edwards and Ansel Adams in the pages of Cameracraft. So this talk centers on the landscape photographs that White made during these years exploring the Oregon countryside with the Hill family. While White would continue to shoot landscapes, from city streets to the fields of upstate New York to the subtle topographics of his abstract hibernal interiors, he would only rarely make images in the American West again, especially in this register. These little discussed images are nonetheless crucial, and they mark a turning point in his formation as a self-taught photographer, honing his technique in remote dialogue with the leaders of American creative photography during the late 1930s and early 1940s, Alfred Stieglitz and Berenice Abbott on the East Coast, and the F-64 group in the West. Indeed, one of Hill's first contributions upon his arrival in the fall of 1946 to San Francisco was to take a negative from one of those late summer trips in 1940, the one up here on the screen. Hill would enlarge it using equipment Ansel Adams' own, found in the basement of that house on 24th Street. This was a valediction of sorts, marking the end of White's time in the wilderness and a consummation of his arrival among the photographic elite. As is well known, Minor White lived in Oregon until 1942, when he shipped off on an Army troop carrier to San Francisco, a reluctant GI who had just completed an unexpectedly successful second five-year plan. The first had been a mastery of poetic verse, to be followed by picking up the rudiments of photography. In those days, this was an act of pilgrimage and autodidacticism, of reading journals, taking field trips with camera clubs, and corresponding with the then small circles of creative photographers during the long hangover of pictorialism. This second phase had gone better than White could have initially hoped, owing in no small part to his engagement as a teacher with the WPA, and from his initial perch as an instructor at the YMCA, living in the Portland Tenderloin and taking on periodic commissions to photograph a rapidly changing city, he was dispatched in 1940 to the northeastern part of the state, that remote stretch of present-day I-84. LeGrand was then, as is now, a small rural town built on the Oregon Trail, then the railroad, gold mining, the university, and finally a sugar factory. But for White, like Edward Muybridge and Ansel Adams before him, it also provided a base camp to test the theories of the group F-64. In Portland, that meant Abbott, who was already a well-known New York photographer of urban life and a proponent of the haunting, depopulated Parisian streetscapes of Eugene Atget. But more generally, in his unpublished diary, Memorable Fancies, White writes of LeGrand in 1984, noting that he, quote, greedily devoured all the books on photography in the Portland Public Library. Now I am gathering all the images I can in Eastern Oregon. Edward Weston and the F-64 group still dominate. A philosophy of straight photography is now being put to the test. By this, he meant the refinement of creative photography in the years after World War I, towards greater precision and medium specificity, and away from the pictorial effects and sentimental darkroom manipulations that had long prevailed. Back east, this was the realism and high gloss of Abbott and Stieglitz, and in Oregon, the gospel of Group F-64, which articulated a theory of straight photography rooted in the American West. The group, consisting of an affiliation of photographers, gallerists, students, and assistants based around the Bay Area, came together in 1932 with a show at the DeYoung Museum. They used exhibitions and magazines to circulate their vision in the years that followed. In practice, this meant using larger format cameras, 4x5s or, when possible, 8x10s, to capture exquisite detail and tonal range, a withdrawal from narrative or realist modes into a space of formalism that ranged from the symbolic to the abstract, and especially in the reckoning of Edward Weston, an emphasis on pre-visualization, on seeing photographically in advance of the shot rather than cropping and processing after the fact. Weston's was a discipline bordering on Jedi mysticism, and that appealed to the young White, who later became known for assiduous control of his output, and later a near monastic existence predicated on cycles of repression and sublimation. And White would have known the general contours of f/64 and its insistence on small aperture and uniform focal range. He explicitly cites, at this time, Weston's first book, previously on the screen, organized by Merle Armitage in 1932, and featuring the carefully lighted, tightly focused still life for which Weston became known after his years in Mexico. Weston's second book included his iconic Monterey cypress trees, alongside a veritable how-to, from theory to technical procedure, of his method. White also cites the Cameracraft essay on f/64, which presumably included Willard Van Dyke's 1933 and John Paul Edwards' overviews of the group's history, roster, and priorities, as well as Ansel Adams' 1935 publication and description of his winter photographs at Yosemite National Park in the Sierra Nevada. In short, Van Dyke's summation of f/64's approach from 1932 onward amounted to an insistence on formalism over aesthetics, indeed a kind of anti-aesthetic, if we assume that aesthetics refers to the long-standing attempt by artists to rationalize the viewer response to certain genres of form, especially around the idea of beauty. By contrast, and echoing the contemporaneous writing of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Paul Strand, Van Dyke and Weston in California posited a break with conventional aesthetics, seeking instead a new modern language with its own specific syntax, usage, and visual manifestation. Such a prescription was detailed, as it were, down to the millimeter, and it was this prescription that White was putting to the test in Oregon. Of course, even for f/64, there was still an admission of beauty. A break from the pictorial, hence the artifice of painting, was hedged in texts like Fernand Léger's Aesthetic of the Machine and Paul Strand's Photography and the New God, as not altogether doing away with beauty, but instead locating it in a way that was native to the machinic age, with the camera as its messenger, elevating even the most banal with exquisite tonality, with its optical unconscious, and in Walter Benjamin's terms, a form that exceeded mere human perception. Hence Henry Swift's high contrast mathematical forms, Imogen Cunningham's texturally rich plants, Edwards' carefully framed harbor studies, and of course, Edward Weston's shells, fruits, and still life of his beloved California coast. For his part, Minor White tried on several variants of the f/64 approach. In Grand Ronde, he tried his hand at the hard Scrabble FSA-style documentary seen in the work of the affiliated Dorothea Lange, alongside the more Abbott Atget-inspired works in Portland that Julia just showed us. More striking or his lucid composition of trees, fence posts, gnarled trunks, and striated leaves. But even in these modes, White already seemed to be looking ahead to the planar distortions and plays of contrast that would shift his work more fully into the realm of abstraction, especially from his time in Rochester onwards. And in this example of a cow skull situated on a ledge, White can't seem to bring himself to the extremes of Edward Weston, who subordinates the vast landscape to the analytic purview of the camera. White cannot, for his part, fully relinquish the environmental context of the object, or the grand sweep of the Oregon landscape beyond. Indeed, by contrast, for Weston, a titanic figure in White's mind for at least the remainder of the decade, and he would later apprentice himself to Edward Weston at Point Lobos. For Weston, even the most epic of landscapes, that repository of awe-inspiring sublime beauty, what Kant called purposiveness without purpose, was stripped of its symbolic or affective value, made ever more potent grist for his eye's pursuit of tonal quality. This is perhaps most evident in his dunescapes at Oceano, which occupied the period of Weston's Guggenheim Award, and also White's pilgrimage to Oregon and his own high desert. But White could and did find refuge in another pillar of f/64, Ansel Adams. Even before Beaumont Newhall dispatched White from New York to establish a CSFA curriculum with Adams, by then a well-established presence in the Yosemite Valley, White had read his treatises on method in the journal Cameracraft, and almost certainly his account of winter photography, which not only posited an archetype of the, quote, Western photographer forged in a rugged Sierra landscape, but also reported on methods of photographing the mountains in winter. That means carrying a small view camera, using snowshoes, adjusting for weather conditions, and the specific highlights of snowpack, and so on. This edict was at least implicit as White collected his exposures in eastern Oregon, a northern branch of Adams' own western mountains, complete with remote summits, broad vistas, and challenging approach hikes. Indeed, many Oregonians will recognize an image like this one on the screen. Somewhere between vacation snapshot and process document, a frequent model Earl Curtis skinning up a hillside on skis in the backcountry. One gets a sense of the crisp air, vivid sunlight, casting coniferous shadows on the powder field, perhaps wisps of spindrift accumulating in the margins. Adams would have cautioned against blue-sensitive film, or heavy filters in this case, and one might imagine his words resonating in White's mind. Quote, "The types of photography possible in Yosemite in winter are many and varied, from expansive landscapes to the minutiae of snow-powdered detail, from the quiet grandeur of mountain and forest to the thrilling sport of skiing," end quote. However, it's an important point to draw a contrast here. Adams pursued a more extreme version of pictorial aesthetics than White ever would. He became legendary for his pictures of the High Sierra in northern New Mexico, creating stirring pictures of the grandeur of the West, quiet or otherwise. So an image like this, which many of you are probably familiar with, is nothing if not exemplary of what we might call sublime beauty, a mode that came to prominence in the European Alps and the Germanic states during the late 18th century, as the land itself became less and less a place of terror and instead one of communion with divinity, sites to be explored, zones of romantic self-discovery, and ultimately redefinition of wilderness as such, places to be preserved and protected with the closing of the frontier. It was indeed paintings such as Thomas Moran's luminous handling of the hellish lunar terrain of northwestern Wyoming that in 1872 convinced Congress to establish the world's first national park. The Yosemite Valley and Half Dome were other Moran subjects, and it too would become a park in 1890. Adams was an inheritor to this tradition, and his photographs would further mediate these kinds of places as American cathedrals, sacred sites of an increasingly settled, militarized, and industrialized horizon. Ansel Adams was also a key officer in the Sierra Club and suggested to the American government that his pictures of those mountains could be used to political ends. The symbolic capacity of place and the sublime power of his pictures, like Moran's and W.H. Jackson's before him, was not lost on Adams. White never seems to have demonstrated such a political edge in his practice, working instead on cultivating his interior life and pursuing camera work not so much as a formal or social construct per se, but as a kind of ontological quest, a form of ascent, both spiritual and technical. Accordingly, even as he put F-64 to the test in Oregon, he steered a middle course between Weston's gelid beauty and Adams's sublime panoramas, all the while leaving clues about his own future practice. In more precise terms, White's Oregon photographs were exemplary of a genre called the picturesque, the making pictorial of nature, the generation of visual pleasure in the act of seeing. And White, not quite yet a budding Freudian, would scarcely deny the voyeuristic compensations of looking through the viewfinder, or the sometimes unconscious symbolism that would emerge in that process. That would yield, in short, scenes, landscapes in Eastern Oregon that say more about the photographer and the photographer's process than about the socio-political function of the result. Perhaps this is why some of White's fondest memories of this time are of taking pictures and then discussing philosophy or the day's work in the country, lounging with Fred Hill under a tree. Perhaps this is why he insisted on Hill's reproduction of those negatives, very much in the master's house, so to speak, of Ansel Adams' own enlarger and production room. Or indeed a more Freudian interpretation, one that he would later apply to himself and one that he would use as a filter in describing the arrows, poles, generator coils, and so on, and for White would suggest a phallic resonance in the dynamic trees and foregrounds of many of his pictures, an important touchstone for a young man struggling with his own sexuality during a time of profound social repression. But there are much more obvious, less speculative readings here as well. If we consider the majority of White's Eastern Oregon photographs as landscape, they hew very closely to then by well-established aesthetic conventions of composition and tone. In particular, images such as these are quintessentially picturesque, that genre of beauty that guided generations of landscape architecture, painting, and as photo historian Joel Snyder and others have argued, photography itself, in determining how the world might be composed pictorially. If aesthetics, after people like Burke, and certainly after Kant, suggest that classical beauty, and certainly the sublime beauty to be found at El Capitan or at Mont Blanc, are intrinsic to nature, the picturesque as a genre concerns itself with artifice and the representations of the world. The refinement of the picturesque as an aesthetic mode, especially in the realm of landscape, coincided with the Industrial Revolution, as the frontier line became ever more distant, and technological forces meant that the land was not to be feared, but romanticized as a zone of self-realization or cultivated contemplation, a managed place of amusement during a time when, as Rebecca Solnit has argued, the railroad, telegraph, and camera simultaneously annihilated spatial distance and indeed time itself. According to that foremost theorist of the picturesque, William Gilpin, the hallmarks of picturesque landscape were not so much that of epic singularity to be found in, for instance, the work of Ansel Adams, or the smooth containment of Weston's Nature Morte, but indeed in variation and roughness, the organization of terrain so that it rises to meet the lingering eye, rewarding it with a broad range of everyday forms, pictorially amplified through the play of light and shadow, the arrangement of a sinuous prospect, and the rumination on antiquated forms, from the weather around a cemetery to a crumbling barn set under a cloud-scattered sky, or the shimmering of a passing storm. The picturesque, in short, was the mode par excellence for 19th century landscape painting, from the Hudson River to the British academic elite, and later, those early pilgrims of the national park, the Carlton Watkinses and Edward Muybridges of the world. It is unclear to the degree to which White was familiar with any of these forebears. He would certainly come to know of Jackson, at least by way of Abbott and Newhall after the war, even purchasing a book on Jackson by the latter, which remains on his shelves to this day. White's photographs taken in Anthony Lakes or Hurricane Trail are nonetheless textbook. They are picturesque in the extreme. This alone is no great revelation. This sort of stylistic mapping might seem quaint in this day and age as a critical approach. However, as W.J.T. Mitchell and others have long argued, landscape is not merely a genre of vernacular realism, but indeed, it is an active verb, to landscape. At a minimum, White's organization of the Oregon terrain around him, from the high vantage after a long approach hike, his ordering of the peaks and desert into forms of inviting, visually pleasing pictorial space, suggest a certain romantic inheritance. These peaks and valleys were, in this account, places of painterly beauty, idealized human mastery of the earth by snowshoe or plowshare, and the coming age of a heroic young man in self-imposed exile. This is the stuff of Goethe or Friedrich or indeed Thoreau, situated at the outer edges of the American frontier, nearly 50 years after its closure. But while White seems to have considered his time in the West more generally in terms that were highly personal, one indeed of testing himself, discovering hidden reservoirs within, he also inherited a tradition of Western photography steeped in power, even violence. Specifically, even if Moran's and Jackson's use of picturesque beauty helped to frame the future national parks as sacralized repositories of divine providence in America, theirs and other photographers' data from the West were integral to a regime of knowledge emerging back east in which the frontier could and would inevitably be mastered, minerals extracted, fields planted, and existing inhabitants evicted. As Solnit and Snyder have both compellingly argued, pictures like this by William Henry Jackson note the picturesque vista here, shot from an elevated promontory, inviting the eye to follow the course of the river, the course of the rail and telegraph lines on its shores, and to be sure, the course of empire itself. These are all crucial to a larger project. There are echoes of this new American Arcadia in White's farmhouses, his fellow hikers at leisure in the high country, and also in his omissions. There is no animal life here, and no people beyond his immediate circle. It is worth noting that the places pictured by Minor White in 1940 and 1941 were, in their way, a Sierra Nevada in miniature, and the 1849 gold rush and the dispossession of the Modoc people in California, captured famously by Muybridge for Harper's Magazine, had their own equivalent in the Eastern Oregon gold rush of roughly the same period, for which towns like La Grande were important base camps. The Grande Ronde, for its part, had long been a place of convergence for the semi-nomadic First Nations of the area, the Walla Walla, Umatilla, Cayute, Nez Perce. These bands were unsurprisingly resettled in the years immediately following the 1855 Treaty of Walla Walla, as the American frontier line inched further and further towards the Pacific. These very figures were in fact captured typologically in the work of another Minnesotan transplant to the Northwest, the amateur ethnographer that Julia mentioned, Edward Curtis, as part of his larger multi-decade project of documenting the very people displaced by the mining and settlement of the valley that had attracted the hills, the WP extension facility, and so on. Landscaping, then, the making picturesque, is necessarily an act of both selective inclusion and exclusion. In the history of the American West, this has long been correlated with processes of settlement, the closing of the frontier, or as familiar to most of us, marking the grandeur of place to simultaneously reify and to conserve a wilderness long called upon to define states such as Oregon and California. Clearly, among the F-64 photographers, White evinces the most sort of possible affinities with Ansel Adams, but crucially, he seemed to share nothing of Adams' more explicitly polemical brand of advocacy, working himself in the more hermeneutic zone of poetics, technical procedure, metaphor, and pedagogy. Which is to say, Adams knowingly adopted a deep history of Western landscape as a tool of persuasion, while Minor White waded into that stream on more plainly spiritual terms. Terms that were nonetheless part and parcel of a socio-political history, inscribed into the very land and its subsequent representations. And so, locating these instances of landscaping Eastern Oregon as White honed his technique is meaningful for us for two reasons. On one hand, this somewhat overlooked area of his practice locates him in a deeper heritage of what Snyder has called territorial photography. One marvels at the serendipity of White's assignment to a remote corner of the state so richly sedimented in histories of exploration, extraction, and displacement so central to America's violent becoming. But then, that's the story of so much of the American West, and it's difficult to impugn cynical intent to White here. More like what we see here is his banal interpolation into larger aesthetic conventions that, by now, we largely take for granted. Indeed, this somewhat passé word, aesthetics, offers a second sense of what White was doing here, neither subordinating the outside world to formalist scrutiny, nor using it, as many of his forebears, as a discursive strategy. Instead, White's Oregon photos find him breaking with Weston, and in short, making pictures. For himself, sure, but also for us, his viewers in waiting. This is arguably a decisive point in his own practice, one that, as we will hear much more about later on, was notable for its insistence on deploying photography as not only a mode of documentary communication, but of carefully modulating the experience of the viewer. And here I'll offer a concluding note. By mid-century, such picturesque handling of American landscapes will return to the fore, from the emergence of earthworks in the 1960s to the so-called new topographics of the following decade. But it was Robert Smithson who would go as far as to carefully re-theorize the aesthetic categories by which landscape could be defined, locating them as a way of expanding the field of sculptural and photographic form. He cited his own intervention into the land as a distinctly American mode that short-circuited the strictures of the gallery and the blind alleys of medium specificity or purity, the formalism so much in the mainstream of the 1960s. Writing in the magazine Art Forum in 1973, a year after his own spiral jetty in northern Utah, Smithson argued that the picturesque was powerful precisely because it dialectically bridged the polarities of the beautiful and sublime, or for our purposes today, between Weston and Adams. Neither one nor the other, but something between that was always in a state of becoming. As a dialectic form, one that allows for irregularity of surface, the collision of nature and artifice, between the pristine and the despoiled, the picturesque was a dynamic and open-ended methodology. For Smithson, of course, the watchword was entropy. But by the 1960s, White, too, had become a kind of countercultural figure, immersed in Zen, occultism, and a range of new publications. For all of his technical rigor, his process, for all of his technical precision, his process had, if anything, become more centered around a word that has many affinities with entropy: chance. The unexpected collision between the photographer in a moment with the ground glass between. Such a play of chance and change prefigured White's insistence from the late 1940s onward on displaying his work in series. In this approach, itself a dialectic, communicative act with the viewer, each photograph gained resonance not as a self-contained artifact, but in relation to the total linear array of images, their meaning generated through contingency, and only, as the decades wore on, as new images emerged to speak to those older works in new ways. As he said simply of series in 1961, quote, "Such groups always contain surprises because the effect of the photographs on each other could not have been imagined till seen together," end quote. It's very tempting then to think of the Oregon landscapes as an exercise in dialectics, one that would frame his own sense of openness and provisionality. These photographs then might not be out of place in a trajectory with Smithson's own picturesque ruins in, for instance, his monuments of Passaic. Certainly there were other experiments during this time, investigations of clouds, which presage his own tutelage after the war with Alfred Stieglitz. Also importantly, homoerotic portraiture, and apparently some attempts at aerial photography, which didn't go so well. But as Fred Hill recounts, that last year, 1942, White seems to have run out of road, teaching too many camera classes, becoming listless and frustrated. His second 5-year plan was drawing to a close, and California was not far off. But he was changed as a photographer and as a person. This is when White became decisively a Westerner, with all that that implies. As is well known, by 1953 he left for Rochester and never really returned, only periodically, as we know. But he wrote to Ma Hill all the way through 1948, plainly miserable and remembering Legrand fondly. His memorable fancies in the years that followed expressed, as is well known, profound frustration. This was a repression of his own desire, of course, sublimated into image making, but also a sort of topographic repression as well. Those pages are full of longing for the West, both as a set of coordinates and as a psychogeographic sensibility. Those years in Oregon and the Bay Area seemed to weld together for him a sense of both authenticity and liberation. He would take this feeling in through small homeopathic doses, by returning to Portland periodically, and notably in 1963 and in 1967 on extended trips through the canyon lands of Utah with various protégés and collaborators such as Art Lazar. These marked his only other sustained engagements with the scale of Western landscape. At this stage, he is arguably at the height of his powers, and at times he indulges in a muscular formalism that rivals even Weston. And perhaps, more significantly, he would also even push past Weston here, into the open horizons of abstraction. The rough, picturesque surfaces of his youth in Legrand are manifested on the far side of his years in exile, during which he carefully refined his ability to work expressively and obliquely, wringing intimate immensity from the tighter confines of the Northeast, and in these images, the inverse, immensity made intimate. But on an even more elemental level, these images index a passage during which White felt fully alive, inhabiting a place of pure transgressive delight. In Utah, during those years, he was home in a way that he had not been since leaving Eastern Oregon, since leaving Oregon more generally on a troop transport some 20 years before. Thank you.
Ian, I have the microphone. Thank you so much. There are multiple nooks and crannies to go through in your talk, but I'd love to make a comment and then potentially ask you a question, or at least get your further thoughts on it. I really appreciate that you brought up the issue of how not political these Eastern Oregon images are, and in working with the material that we have here at the museum, I keep wanting to infuse politics into them, which to me it makes sense that they should be. These are WPA photographs. He's working for a government program. He's working at a time when the world is about to go to war. I feel like, and many of the photographs he's making are of, especially in Portland, are of parts of the city that no longer exist, or they're part of the economy. And I find that I can't push that angle. It just doesn't work because it seems like it's not there, and I struggle with it. So as a curator, I have to be careful to not overemphasize these ideas. But the work is so harsh and so striking in Eastern Oregon, and for those many people in this room have been there, it makes perfect sense. And so I also love that you sort of drew it back to what, like, potentially the King survey and O'Sullivan photographs and so on, which was very helpful to me. But do you find yourself wanting to infuse as much as possible, politically in there, and it's just not there, or am I alone in that?
No, I think that I mean, hopefully one thing that I did communicate is that, much as you're describing with the WPA, there is all this atmospheric or contextual stuff in which the photographs are made. He can never escape that. So he is entering into a political dialogue whether he wants to or not. But it is sort of frustrating if you're interested in these more sort of social histories of art, going through, sitting in the archive day after day, and you're looking for a more polemical or political connection. I mean, his life was, you know, from his sexuality to where he lived to the things he was trying to do with photography. We can identify these things retroactively as being transgressive gestures, but he himself was so ruthlessly focused on being a good photographer and communicating what being a photographer was to students and so on. So I think there's a refusal and even redactions in his notes when he goes a little too far. So I think he would deny a political edge to these things, but I think it's latently there, but we have to be careful not to project too much. Yeah.
It may be that he saved some of his political kind of communications for the work that essentially didn't make it into the WPA portfolios. Another potential line of investigation there would be his work on Bonneville Dam, because the People's Power League was actually a citizen activist group. That's Peter Brunel says that's the closest he ever came to politics, was working for that group, which was trying to negotiate for public utility districts that had cheaper rates than were going to come down through the BPA. Although there's some kind of contradictory evidence in the documentation whether he actually worked for the BPA or doing work for the People's Power League, which that would be an interesting area to follow up on to go into your question a bit more.
I also just want to make clear, I'm part of the reason I was attracted to these is I lived for a summer in a pickup truck kind of in this part of the world as well. Grad school was so wonderful that way. But it's okay to like these images. That's part of what he was doing, and that's the power of the picturesque, to produce images that we want to look at, that feel familiar to us, that tame the landscape in a way. So I think for those of you who know Eastern Oregon or the Sierras, there's something very special about these images as well, even without these kind of more structural or political readings. And I'm just trying to imagine him coming from Minnesota, right, and seeing this.
In the little that I know about Ansel Adams, I think he was involved in some polemical battles in the 30s with pictorialists. And did Minor White have anything to say about that group of photographers?
Which group?
I think there were the people who like these kind of fuzzy imaged.
Oh, pictorialists.
Yeah, pictorialists. Yes.
Yeah.
I was wondering if he had anything to say on that topic.
Well, there are scattered references that I found are archivally, but generally speaking, he's making a polemical argument implicitly by what he says we should do, as opposed to what he says we shouldn't do, I think. So certainly if you were a photographer, an amateur creative photographer in the 20s and 30s, and you're reading journals, pictorialism was the style. And there was even a passage about an Oregon-based critic in the 1930s deriding the F-64 group because he says they're sort of very poorly adopting European precisionism. I mean, pictorialism was incredibly popular and resonant for many people. So it's hard to imagine now, but the kind of straight modernist photography that people like he was doing and learning from Ed Weston and Ansel Adams was pretty radical at the time and controversial. So I think just electing to choose those reference points, Berenice Abbott in New York or Adams and Weston, that was a declaration of sorts for where his affinities lie. And as he said, he was testing those procedures here.
Ian, thanks for that. It was a really fascinating discussion of this work. And the picturesque, I think, is a useful category for describing these things. But I guess I still register a certain hesitation in the notion of the taming versus what I would call the tamed landscape. So that, for instance, if I were to see how Adams would approach this landscape, he would avoid spaces which were parcelized, right? So the whole point, I think, of White's revision of that tradition is that the landscape is always already shot through with a human, rather than the Weston and Adams kind of stripping bare. So that, I mean, this is close, of course, to what Adams is up to, but the way that it completely clarifies the sense in which this land has been shaped in a kind of already inhabited all the way down to a certain extent. Strikes me as like crucial for White's approach. I mean, I'll talk about later his kind of commitment to anthropomorphization, but to see it always already as tamed and humanized seems to be his kind of, his take. I'm not sure what you kind of think of that.
No, that's very helpful, and I think a kind of level of precision that I should be clear about. Yeah, I think, so it's all on a spectrum, but if we look at Adams, he's really working in more of a sublime, picturesque tradition of capturing an unspoiled wilderness that really only exists as a cordoned off part of the United States. It exists more in our imagination, and we have to protect it through the park system. But I think the picturesque more generally, particularly in British versions, for instance, you always see people in the frame as well. It's people coexisting in farmsteads and so on, or people in the Hudson School with easels looking out over the Oxbow or something. So I think you're absolutely right. The picturesque assumes a tamed landscape, and that's partially why I think for someone like Tom Mitchell it's so dangerous in a way, because it suggests that there is no wilderness, that the land can be contained, can be tamed, like that Jackson photograph of the railroad line and the telegraph line. So I think this is a crucial distinction. Thank you.
I'll just add, and it's partly because you opened with the anecdote about Hill wanting to recreate the photo, that on the heels of Todd's comment, I think part of what's critical here is access. In addition to it being a tamed landscape, the idea, whether we're talking about Moran and getting an easel up there, or whether we're talking about the snake of the railway and telegraph lines in the William Henry Jackson, or this photograph that Tom Hill knows on some level he could go back and recreate decades later, there's a sense of access. So while it may be cordoned off, there's a belief that others could get there, others could see this same view, others could even potentially frame or reframe this same view. And that may be helpful, and certainly reminds me of the slide you started with, the framing device. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Kate.
I'm curious with respect to the technical aspects. Some of us old-timers lived with the zone system manual, which to me reflected White's insistence on technical expertise. And I must have reread that 20 times because there was an error in it that I don't know if people had caught, but I'd be curious as to your response to his insistence on real technical expertise, perhaps even greater than Ansell's at one time.
You know, in these days, the zone system still, I think, a ways off in his mind. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he's developing more of a philosophical approach and learning from who are then the masters of this modernist form in the Western U.S. So he's already got a clear appreciation for the technical dimension, but he's not arrived at the zone system yet. And I think we see him sort of hashing it out here and figuring that out. We were noting upstairs in the exhibition that even after 2 years of printing in Oregon, he was already a masterful printer. It was remarkable. But then you have other examples. I'm just going to scroll back through quickly here. Let's see, what's a good one here? Like, I don't think this one's printed particularly well, right? And some of these just don't work out. And if you look archivally as well, he printed these in many different forms. But I think for him, it's really hard to capture the kind of light you have in Oregon and in the West in general. So really harsh light, the strong blues you get in town and in the mountains. This is why in 35, Adams is writing about how to take pictures in the mountains, because people just didn't know how to do it very well, by and large. So I think this time it seems like he'd more or less mastered printing shots in the city, but he was still figuring out how to take pictures in nature, as it were. So I would say it was crucial to him, but it was a time of experimentation rather than having arrived, and some of these are certainly better than others. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but yeah. And he was using large cameras as well.
I work at the Oregon Historical Society. I'm going to be on the next panel. And in hearing your presentation, I was thinking about when I started working at the Historical Society, I was surprised to find minor white negatives in our collection. And the other collection that we have that I was also surprised to find was Carlton Watkins' Mammoth, original Mammoth prints. And the minor white we have are not landscape. But I couldn't help but wonder, most of those mammoths that we have, I'm pretty sure came in before White would have left Portland. And so I'm curious if you or anybody has seen anything where he talks about Carleton Watkins, if he was aware of Carleton Watkins, if he even visited the Historical Society to look at the mammoth prints, and if there was any overlap there, just as another Western and specifically Oregon landscape photographer.
I would love if someone in the audience could help with this, because he mentions in Memorable Fancies that he was so interested in doing other stuff while he was here that he doesn't write as much as he could have, which can be a little frustrating. But so the references that he gives, at least in the Princeton archives, I've listed here. So if people know of other stuff he was looking at whilst here, that would be really interesting.
I was just going to add, he definitely was, during this time frame, he was reading everything he could get his hands on about the history of photography as well as the technique, and was giving lectures in the 40-41 time period on like the first 100 years in photography. It would be interesting to know if who he was pointing to. But in '58, he did address in sort of a lecture that he gave called Two Photographs. He said that at the time, this period, the pictorial field was what I was most interested in, any way I could get a hold of it. For a definition of the pictorial, we can use a rather simple one in which the subject is less important than the image or photograph. Now, that does not mean that the subject disappears, but it does mean that the photographer and those who like this kind of photography are concerned with the design elements, conscious of it, make use of it, and recognize the communication or the evocation of an emotional side that design can bring about. Which I just thought it was interesting that he sort of was looking at pictorialism that way and not necessarily kind of the soft focus, kind of, early Steichen kind of salon type that we usually associate with the term.
I've been interested in the history of Oregon photography for a long time, and in the early 1990s, I started meeting on a monthly basis with most of the people who were members of the camera club with Minor White, and I didn't know Minor because he had already passed away, but I knew most of the other people who were involved in his camera club, the YMCA camera club. And I've also read Camera Craft cover to cover, and most photography magazines from the period and studied them. And it would be difficult to explain how people thought about fine art photography in the 1930s. It just wouldn't make sense anymore. Edward Weston sent his prints to the Art Museum for inclusion in an exhibition, and they were rejected. Only one judge, Henry Berger, voted for them to be included because they were straight photography. And that is not what art photography was considered to be in the 1920s and 30s, and this is why Edward Weston, Ansel Adams, and Minor White were all so revolutionary. They were definitely tipping the apple cart over as to what Minor knew, and when he knew it. Minor arrived in Portland with a 35mm camera and was taught how to develop film by Ray Wing, but soon became the teacher. And he advanced so quickly that he went from student to teacher in just the period of 2 short years. And he was an instructor with Don, and they were the instructors in the YMCA. He went from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time in a world that's much different than what it is now.
Absolutely. And it's hard to remember that, I mean, photography was largely maligned in the art world, such as it was, and the history itself doesn't even really start emerging, I mean, as we know it, until maybe even the 1940s and 50s, correct me if I'm wrong. So people like Beaumont Newhall are laying down the first draft and putting together the first textbooks, and in the 1930s, you would have had to have looked to the very journals that you mentioned, right? These amateur photographic journals. So to be able to say, here is the first 100 years of photography, here's where I land in that lineage, it would have been hard to imagine at that time, right, in a way that we could now.
I just have a short question, that is, we seem to talk about Minor White from here in Portland when he first came from Minnesota. But do we know anything about his childhood and his school life, any of his artwork as a teenager? Or I remember that his father especially wasn't particularly fond of what he wanted to do with his life. But was there anything left? They seemed to correspond with his mother.
From what I can tell, in the fancies, the entries are very spotty, right? And he even says to Lynn Hill that he has to go as the war is coming to an end, he has to go back to Minneapolis, and he says he doesn't want to. He wants to see her instead because, in effect, the people in Oregon had become his real family, and his Minnesota family didn't understand him. But that's about the extent to what I can remember. But if anyone else can answer that question.
I can answer parts of it. And anyone, please feel free to correct me. But I do find it very interesting that Minor was someone who it took a little bit longer for him to move into exactly what he wanted. So there was some interest in photography as a youth. Apparently his grandfather showed lantern slides quite often and so on. He originally studied botany. He thought he might go into the sciences. Literature, poetry were also incredibly important to him at first. So it takes him a while to actually graduate from university and then from there move on and decide to come out to Portland. And, or it may have actually been Seattle where he was trying to go but ran out of money in Portland. So there is this kind of faceted young life. And correct me if I'm wrong, that I believe his parents found out about his sexuality early on. I believe they had read one of his writings or his diary. So there was no real communication about that, but there is an indication that his sexuality is an issue early on, and he is journaling about it and writing about it, and it is discovered, and it's just kind of swept under the rug. So there are issues within his core family, certainly, that are going on, and perhaps discomforts. But for him to spend time in Minnesota and figure out where does he want to go, is it the sciences, is it the arts, and then eventually makes his way here. But that is my general understanding of these early years. I don't know about any particular artwork other than writing that he would have been making at that time.
I was just going to add to that. Ian mentioned the 5-year plans, and so at least in his own narrative of that transition from verse and poetry, he explicitly said, I'm going to give Minnesota in 1937, I'm going to give myself 5 years to try to find poetry and photographs, and sort of made this conscious change in medium, and like many people during the Depression, just kind of headed west, got on a bus, and didn't have a destination, obviously didn't have a job lined up. But the notion was that he was going to try it out for 5 years, and if it didn't work out, then he would probably keep looking in another venue.